So, without further ado, did my voice just crack? I think it did. I'm going to cut that.
From ScienceSortOf.com, you're listening to Science Sort of.
Hello and welcome to Science Sort of. You're listening to episode 313. Our theme this week is debating diapsids. I'm your host, Ryan, and joining me to talk about things that are science, things that are sort of science, and things that wish they were science, right now, no one. I am sitting alone in my apartment. I guess Charlie is here, but not the Charlie you're used to, because for some odd reason, I also named my dog Charlie, but it's spelled differently, so that's the saving grace, I suppose, for accidentally naming your dog after your podcast co-host. But we're going to move right on from that, because this episode, I had the extreme pleasure of talking to Adam Pritchard. Adam Pritchard is a paleontologist who was doing a postdoc at Smithsonian Museum of Natural History, but is now taking a job down at the Virginia Museum of Natural History, which sounds like it should be located nearby, but is actually basically across the entire state of Virginia, right there on the border of North Carolina. So sadly, he's further away from where I am now, but we had a great time chatting. I was super excited to get him on the show before he headed south to his new job. Adam is a reptilian expert, as you will soon see from this conversation, and I feel like we barely scratched the surface in our discussion of all things reptilians, so hopefully Adam will come back on the show and keep talking to us in the future, but I think you'll hear in the interview that we have a really great rapport, in my opinion, and I had a lot of fun chatting with him, and I hope you all really enjoy listening to the interview. So check out the first half now. I'll be back in a bit to tell you about a drink, and then we'll wrap up the show and get you on your way. All right, here we go. So we're being joined by Adam Pritchard, currently serving as a postdoctoral research fellow at the Smithsonian, but about to take up a job as the assistant curator at the Virginia Museum of Natural History. And you are a reptile guy. And
I am a reptile guy.
Maybe the broadest possible sense. So we're going to get into that. But first, I want to know, what's your origin story? What paleontologist bit you that made you want to become a paleontologist?
How far back do you want me to go?
Well, it's deep time, So
yeah, that's fair. So, family vacation to the Eastern Shore when I was 2 years old. We got a kids meal at a Wendy's in the Chesapeake Bay area. And there was a plastic figurine of a Parasaurolophus, the long crested duck-billed hadrosaur.
I was just talking about this dinosaur. It's one of my favorites.
It's a great dinosaur, and it's
might be my favorite hadrosaur.
It's a good choice. Yeah. It's a good choice.
Is it too basic though? It's kind of a basic choice for a favorite hadrosaur.
I mean, you got to go with something that's both ostentatious and, some decent fossil material.
They don't get enough credit for being a T-Rex-sized animal. Like, they were up there.
Oh, yeah, they're huge.
Yeah.
Well, some of them are huge.
Yeah, like the Montosaurus and Lambeosaurus and some of those. So, anyway, you got a Parasaurolophus toy?
Yeah.
You say Parasaurolophus, not Parasaurolophus?
Yeah.
I'm a Parasaurolophus guy, too, so I'm with you.
All right. And that is entirely historical contingency, because it's like I started saying it that way as soon as I could speak, and now every time I hear someone say it the other way, I think, are they saying it right?
I don't think so. I can't believe that they are.
Is this the way Osborne was saying it back in like the early 20th century? Or should I care? Should I not care? Either way. And that figurine, I don't remember my actual exact reaction back that far, but it started a lifelong obsession with just like the incredible variety of form in these ancient animals. It was something. Parasaurolophus, if you look at it today, it's an alien compared to what we have around us today. It's doing insane things with its head. It's doing insane things with its body relative to the animals we have today.
And the most complex teeth that have ever evolved on planet Earth.
It's absurd. And the funny thing is, like, for a child, you can look at the outside and see, like, wow, this is a reptile with, standing on its hind legs, with a giant thing sticking out the back of its head. And that's like the kernel, the incipient interest right there. But as you delve into it, as you learn more about how the anatomy of animals works in the modern day and in the fossil record, it gets even weirder, because then you start to realize, holy cow, this thing's teeth are just like, it's got these walls of teeth that form these continuous grinding dental batteries that are worn away and replaced constantly.
Types of tissue.
Yeah, it's insanity. And it's like, yeah, and then you get even further into, beyond tooth morphology.
For people keeping score at home.
Yeah,
so.
And that's just it, though. Once you get beyond just the anatomy of the teeth, then you get into the tissues that make up the teeth. And even there, they're still doing insane things. So it's, yeah.
So there's just a ripe world in front of you.
Exactly. The more you learn about how animals and organisms are put together, the more the fossil record gets interesting, because the more you realize if you only look at the modern day, you're missing so much of the possibilities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so did you hold on to that fascination all through school, or did you get back into it in college? Where'd you end up going to college?
It waffled. Yeah. It waffled for quite a bit in just my elementary and then middle and high school days. In college, I convinced myself that I didn't know what I wanted to do, because I knew paleontology was not the easiest of career paths even then. But fortunately, I had a wonderful cadre of friends and family around me that kind of realized that I still kept talking about this stuff constantly. And so by the time it was time to apply for grad school, I had some good friends that were like, you should apply for.
So where were you in undergrad, and what did you major in that paleo grad school was a possibility?
I went to a tiny liberal arts school in Central Maryland, McDaniel College, in Westminster, Maryland. Just got a regular biology degree. There were no specialist paleo people or anything like that.
And did you have any research opportunities as an undergrad, or?
I worked a little bit on just kind of zebrafish morphology while I was there. I still wanted to do anatomy, because that was what was. That was still what was driving my interests.
So when you made the jump undergrad to grad school, you were taking essentially this leap into all of deep time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No. And in terms of, like, I felt like I had, in a way, I had a good grip on fossils and what was known about things like dinosaurs or fossil mammals. But what I didn't know, and I wish I had known in retrospect, was just how graduate school works. Because I knew nothing.
Yeah, I am glad. One of the reasons I'm glad I went to a larger university for undergrad is because I got to meet a lot of grad students and see what the lifestyle was like. And every once in a while they invite me to a grad student party, and I was like, I'm very into this compared to the lame undergraduate parties. I was like, undergrads do not know how to party relative to grad schools. I mean, Santa Cruz, they were all too stoned to throw a good party, but whereas the grad students had work to do. Yeah, so you have a biology degree. And then where'd you end up going to grad school?
I ended up going to Stony Brook University on Long Island in New York, where I was in the Department of Anatomical Sciences.
Okay, so good for a person who wants to get into anatomy.
Mm-hmm.
And then is that where you really got to start doing reptile stuff?
Yeah. No, I was in the lab of Alan Turner, who is a systematist whose concentration is primarily on, well, it's actually two concentrations. He works on the sort of dinosaur-bird transition, focused on the systematics of dromaeosaurs, troodontids, early bird things.
I like a troodontid. They don't get enough play, but it's a good.
I don't know. It's a good group.
It's a good animal.
It's a good group. And then he also works on crocodilomorphs, so the croc line within the Jurassic and Cretaceous, and then their fossil relatives going back into the Triassic.
Yeah, the Triassic was kind of a Suchian world.
It was
terrifying. Well, it must have been a terrifying
kind of a Suchian world.
There was other stuff going on?
I am biased in a way that makes me make that argument.
Okay,
yes.
Fair enough. So now that you've finished your graduate work and are a postdoc now and getting ready to go become a museum curator, at this point in your career, what kind of scientist do you sort of identify as?
I think I label myself as a paleontologist.
You just say paleontologist.
Yeah. And although I am of the mind, which I believe you are as well, that the answer differs depending on who you're talking to.
How would you answer if you were at like GSA or SVP?
Nah, I'd still say paleontologist.
You'd just say paleontologist?
Yeah, I'd say paleontologist, and I work on this.
Okay,
cool.
I
feel like, for me, that's where if I split things up further, it comes out after I just say, I'm a paleontologist.
I will usually tell other people who work in earth sciences that I'm a paleoecologist. But I am very fast and loose with the, like, if it benefits me in the moment to point out that I have experience doing geology, I'll be a geologist.
Yes.
If it benefits me in the moment to be a biologist, I'll be the biologist.
Definitely.
And a lot of times I'll just do it contrary to what, if I'm with a group of biologists, I'll be the geologist. And if I'm with a group of geologists, I want to be the guy talking about the biology. So,
I'm the different one.
yeah. Look at me, I'm special. Okay, so we've talked about your background, how you kind of got to where you are.
Did we? Because I have no idea how I got where I am.
and let's talk about your research. So I mentioned that you're a reptile guy. I think one of the things that you point out really early in your talks that I've been to a couple of now is that, like, we don't think about reptiles in a expansive enough way, it seems. So can you kind of like maybe kind of walk us through that first slide where you just point out the crazy diversity of reptilian forms?
So today I'll go through my spiel.
Pretend this is a job talk.
Sure. Get back in that mode.
I don't know
Okay.
if any of us
stress
want that.
myself out a little bit, pump myself full of more adrenaline. Okay. Reptiles today make up a dominant portion of terrestrial vertebrate diversity at over 20,000 living species. And then in addition to things like crocs, snakes, lizards, turtles,
Can't forget the turts.
tuatara, that also includes birds, in my definition, because birds, descended out of the same sort of cauldron of evolution.
Yeah,
that
there's a very derived archosaur.
all of the scaly things. Exactly, yeah. And so they're a big part of what's on land today in terms of backboned animals. And then add to that just all the stuff that's going on the lines leading up to those great lineages in the fossil record, in the Cretaceous period, in the Jurassic, and you just get this incredible variety of body size, of body shapes, just every kind of role in the ecosystems of those days that you can possibly think of. They're doing some version of it, and that's crazy, and it's remarkable. And what I find really interesting to study is where sort of, I mentioned that cauldron out of which all of these things were produced, is looking at what's actually going into that at the very beginning. What is the sort of seed that gives rise to all of these great branches that produce the variety of reptiles that we see?
So let's dig into that. When you use the term reptile, like, what exactly does that mean?
So I play fast and loose with it sometimes. I don't know how familiar the audience will be with terms like crown group, stem group.
Probably those are the sort of things we probably need to break down, at least at least define them. Yeah.
So reptile in this case is, we'll go with a crown group definition for reptilia. So a crown group includes all of the living members that you assign to a group. So we'll go through all the living reptiles again: crocs, birds, lizards, snakes, tuatara, turtles, and everything that's extinct back to the single most recent common ancestor of that group.
Okay.
So crown group reptiles.
Have you talked about this on your show? Is there an episode I can point to?
No, not really. I mean, we talked a little bit about what is a diapsid way back when, before I knew what I was doing with my dissertation. So I'm actually afraid to listen to that episode.
It's hard to go back too far.
It's probably,
you gotta be careful.
The audio quality is good. There's going to be like a continuous electric hum in the background because we were probably using our MacBooks to record.
You should go back and release digitally remastered versions of...
Is that just going into Audacity and removing the background noise?
That would technically count as a digitally remastered...
True. I guess it would.
Mastered file, and then you could re-release the episode and delete the old one.
The point being, there's no really good place to go back to.
And so diapsid, you use that word. Can you...
Sure.
I know what that means, but for our listeners...
I'm proud. So diapsid includes all of those living reptile groups, and then a wide variety of fossil forms that are sort of on the stem that leads up to that single most recent common ancestor.
So that first common ancestor, we're going to say that's the first true, full reptile.
Reptile.
Okay.
And then diapsids include all of those things, and then a bunch of other things.
So Diapsids a bigger group.
A much bigger group that extends much further back in time.
And what defines a diapsid? Like, how do you identify one of those?
The classic understanding of them is based on holes in the head.
Super into trepanation, these animals were.
Mm-hmm. So if you pop the skull off of a modern lizard and look behind the eyes, the orbital cavities, you'll see two large additional cavities. Fenestrae, yeah. Temporal fenestrae.
Which literally means like windows.
Yeah.
And temporal because they're like at the temple, basically, where on our skull. Our
exactly.
skulls, it's always hard to talk about reptile skulls in comparison to mammal skulls because they're just so differently built.
Yeah. But, I mean, it's kind of nice because if you go back to the stem that leads to the mammals, way back when, we are synapsids. So our ancient ancestors have one hole on the lateral surface of the skull. Diapsids look a lot like that, have that same cavity, and then an additional one on top of the skull.
And then turtles are anapsids, so turtles are doing something weird.
And this is the problem with these names.
This is where you get excited.
These names, I actually get cranky.
Okay.
Because, these names are very much based on the anatomy that the scientists in 1903 or whenever these groups were first really recognized, they were named based on these features of the skull and not on the history of these groups.
Well, I mean, I think about it in terms of, we were talking about hadrosaurs earlier. Hadrosaurs are ornithischian ornithopods, which literally means bird-hipped, bird-foot. They're extinct. Yeah. It is the lizard-hipped, the saurischian theropods, which means lizard-hipped beast-foot, and beast usually in that context would refer to like a mammal. Those are the birds. So it's like we did a number on ourselves and made it much harder for the public. It's hard because it's like, how do you go back and change it?
Yeah.
Because there's so much literature already. I mean, I don't think it's probably not worth changing just for the nomenclature's sake, but it does make things harder to explain.
And the big problem with the diapsid name is it refers to those two holes in the skull. Very quickly in their fossil history, groups of animals that descended from that ancient diapsid ancestor started closing up some of the holes in their skulls. One family would close up the top hole in the skull. Another family would close up the lower hole and keep the top hole intact.
What's functionally happening there? Like, what kind of adaptations are you making when you do that sort of thing?
It's an interesting question because we know what sits in there. If you cut open the head of a modern lizard or a modern croc, both of which have both fenestrae, you'll find that the space that those windows look in on is the adductor chamber. So it's the portion of the skull that's really dedicated to jaw closing musculature. Right. They fill that space really, really extensively. But it's not exactly clear how much good having an extra window in on the chamber. It's not clear what that does.
Yeah.
It's not like it's sometimes been suggested in the literature that, you've got those adductor muscles in that chamber. If you open up fenestrae, those muscles can get even bigger and bulge out from those cavities. And
they have more places to attach to,
They have more places to attach to. But there's no real study that has shown conclusively that, yes, this is a good explanation for why a fenestra is really, really worth having.
Here's something I never asked or even thought about before. Are we still synapsids? I know we're still synapsid in the evolutionary sense, but is our skull still a synapsid skull?
Because we've got the zygomatic arch
that
sits along the side of the head. And
cheekbones?
Okay.
Mm-hmm. That's the fenestra. That's what makes us a synapsid?
Effectively.
Okay, cool. Just never thought about if we were still living that synapsid life. And then what's the deal? Have we figured out urapsids? Because when I was in college, it seemed like urapsids were this weird wild card. Like anapsids, turtles, no holes in the skull. We had that pretty well figured out because turtles are just heavily built animals.
Yep.
So you just
they close
everything up.
They close up their holes.
Armor all. You're good to go. You're good to live that turtle life. But what was the deal with the urapsids?
Well, I think it's, again, one of those groups. Euryapsid refers to...
Oh, euryapsid. Okay, sorry.
Yeah.
I thought
Euryapsids refer to those reptiles that only possess that upper hole in the skull, the upper temporal fenestra, and do not have the lower. And there was a time when most biology textbooks sections were set in stone on this sort of thing, where that was believed to be a single monolithic group, where this happened once in the common ancestor of the Euryapsids, that they closed the lower temporal fenestra.
Those are like the marine reptiles?
That includes the marine reptiles, a couple weird Triassic things that also have that same construction. But the reality seems to be that multiple groups of diapsids and some within the crown group reptiles closed up the lower temporal opening to build this Euryapsid skull condition. And it's not a group with a single history. Okay. It's a group that's just sort of a hodgepodge of different lineages within diapsids that did a certain kind of closure of the skull. And in terms of like the biggest group that belongs within that Euryapsid category is Sauropterygia, which is the marine reptiles that includes the plesiosaurs, the short-necked pliosaurs, weird shell-crushing forms called placodonts in the Triassic. Basically, anything that wasn't a mosasaur or an ichthyosaur in the seas of the Jurassic. Because
mosasaurs are lepidosaurs, or more closely related to
them? They're lizards. They're
truly
just straight
lizards?
lizards. Okay. Yeah. So they're actually mosasaurs, in terms of like knowing where they fit in the tree of life, they're decently well resolved. They're some kind of lizard.
Ichthyosaurs, of course, are marine mammals. As far as I'm making a joke. It was intended as.
I did.
That was an attempt at comedy. Yeah, I feel like I've broken you now, though.
I'm sorry. No, I never laugh at phylogeny jokes because I take it all too seriously.
I just knocked over the whole house of cards. So wait, where do ichthyosaurs fit?
I have no idea.
We don't know.
No, they're diapsids of some kind, and that's the problem with a lot of these ancient groups. Ichthyosaurs and Sauropterygians both emerge almost instantaneously in the fossil record after the Permo-Triassic extinction, the biggest extinction in Earth's history.
One.
Yeah, the really bad one, but also the one where we know jack of what's going on in terms of like land ecosystems or backboned animals.
Yeah.
We just don't know what the heck is going on in a lot of these things. Even though the Permian-Triassic extinction is actually really important for what I do, because no matter what effect it had on specific groups of backboned animals on land or in the water, it's pretty darn clear that the wake of the Permian-Triassic extinction is the time where diapsids go from being a kind of marginal, quiet component of ecosystems around the world to being dinosaurs and crocodiles and lizards, and then all of these weird, insane, bizarre lineages that dominate the early Mesozoic. They go so quickly from something quiet to something that's incredibly loud and dominant.
So let's take that journey back in time a little bit. When tetrapods, backboned, land-dwelling vertebrates first started showing up, we think of these like Acanthostega and Tiktaalik, and they're not technically amphibians, but they lived an amphibious lifestyle.
Right, yeah.
They're not phylogenetically in the group that we now call amphibians.
But they still look like chunky salamanders.
They still look like a big old hellbender or snot otter. Which Pennsylvania just made. I think I talked about this on the show already. Pennsylvania made their state amphibian.
Oh, that's wonderful.
It is wonderful. The eastern hellbender needs some love, that little mud puppy. And so that's what those animals were doing, and then those are the animals that become the synapsids and the diapsids. And so at that point in time, like, is there functionally a lot of distinction between the synapsids and the diapsids? Are they're both egg-laying, not quite reptiles, but their eggs can at least be laid on land? Like, are they amniotes at that point?
They're definitely, when we get sort of the initial amniotes, that first kind of...
And amniotes are the first animals that can lay their eggs on land. Mm. They're fully detached from the water as part of their lifestyle. They still need to drink water, but...
Yeah, at that point you get sort of that's when the initial split between the line that will lead to the diapsids and the line that leads to the synapsids and consequently us first happens. That is 300 plus million years ago, so that's happening in the Carboniferous.
Okay.
And quite honestly, if you look at the earliest members of both lineages in the fossil record, if they were standing here on the table with us, where they would all be relatively small, they could sit comfortably on our laptops, they would look like weird skinny lizards.
Okay.
They really don't look all that distinct. But relatively rapidly, as you get into the Carboniferous, you see kind of a huge variety show up on the synapsid line. You get things like Dimetrodon, you get things like Edaphosaurus, which is effectively an herbivorous
thing. Is that the one with a really small head and the giant body?
No. So Edaphosaurus also got a small head, but it's got really kind of complex grinding surfaces made up of its palate teeth. It looks like a really herbivorous specialist, but with a Dimetrodon sail.
Wow.
And then there's an animal called Catilla.
It was hot back then. You had to dissipate the heat somehow.
I guess so. But then you've got a lineage called the Caryids that are some of the first to show up, which are these really big lizard-like sprawling, chunky, herbivorous synapsids, but with tiny little pinheads. Yeah. Including the biggest pinhead, which is an animal called Catilla.
I mean, they almost look like land plesiosaurs. Like they've got these like big kind of barrel-shaped bodies.
With no neck.
No, they don't have the neck. They've
just got a head that sits on top of that giant body.
And so we're taking this early diapsid, which was lizard-like. Mm-hmm. What changes do you need to see for us to start calling this animal a reptile?
Well,
and what's the time frame over which we're starting 300 million years ago? So what changes does that earliest diapsid need to make to become a reptile, and over what span of time?
So between about 300 and 250 million years ago, that's about the span of the Permian. In that time, the synapsid line does some of the things we were just talking about. You get big carnivores, big herbivores, all kinds of small animals.
So the synapsids had an initial jump start over the
they were doing really impressive things. And quite honestly, for much of their early history, like the diapsids start the Permian looking like tiny lizard things, and they stay that way throughout nearly all of the Permian. You get a couple of weird members of that lineage within the Permian. You get a gliding group called the Weigeltosaurs that look like lizards with almost a ceratopsian frill sticking out the back of their head with little spikes, and then I
would not want that flying at me.
They're small enough that it would actually probably be really cute.
Okay.
And then they've got a patagium.
Like season 2 dragons in Game of Thrones. Like still
not
still
even
ride on
that.
your shoulder?
I'm talking like just out of the egg.
Okay.
Just out of the egg. Yeah, no, they could ride around on your shoulder. And, they've got a wing membrane, a patagium that's made up of these long, bony...
I've never heard that word before. Patagium?
Patagium?
Is that the scientific term for wing membrane?
Well, yes. Yeah, it is basically a skin-based membrane that supports some kind of gliding surface. That makes sense.
So not powered flight, just gliding.
Well, even a pterosaur's, like the portions of a pterosaur's wing that are made up of skin are still referred to as patagium.
But these animals, the
little Weigeltosaurs, the diapsid experiment in gliding, it wouldn't have been powered flight. They would have flashed out their patagium and glided from tree to tree. Yeah. Very similar to flying squirrels. But that was one of the only real sort of experiments in doing something that wasn't being a kind of skinny lizard-looking thing for diapsids in the Permian. Once you get to the late Permian, you get a couple of them that are show a little bit of aquatic adaptations. They've got kind of a long paddle tail, things like that, but still not very large. And it's right at the end of the Permian, you see sort of the first diapsids that get over a meter or so in length. You get a long-necked, kind of monitor lizard-looking form called Proterosaurus. And then you've got the largest of all is an animal called Archosaurus, which would be about 10 feet in length.
The arch lizard.
Yeah. 10 feet in length, really large head with kind of recurved, serrated teeth. Really the first experiment being a big predator on that lineage. And then the Permian extinction happens.
Which, to reiterate, the worst mass extinction, as far as we know, the worst mass extinction in the history of life on Earth. You could maybe argue that the Great Oxygenation was worse, but that's
as soon as we can calculate percentages there, then,
But in terms of vertebrate extinctions that are preserved in the fossil record, there is no worse time on Earth.
Well, that's sort of the wrinkle about the whole thing.
About the Permian Triassic experiment? I only hammer the point home because the news about the Tanis site came out a couple of weeks ago. This episode and everyone was like, this is the worst day on Earth. I'm like, no, it wasn't. It was a bad day, but it wasn't the worst day on Earth. Earth has had worse days and worse extinctions than the end Cretaceous extinction. So I just wanted to push back on that narrative. I wasn't trying to push back on what you're saying.
No. If you want to crap on the Cretaceous extinction, go ahead. I do not mind that. But what's cool, what I think is amazing about the Permian extinction is the numbers that we have for it, 90%, 95%, are, they're huge catastrophic things, but they refer to a record of invertebrate animals
Mostly marine
in the
stuff.
oceans.
Yeah.
Because that's what the good fossil record is. The fossil record of the things I study, it's awful. It sucks so bad.
The world was a weird place for terrestrial preservation back then because rivers didn't work the same way, sediment deposition didn't work the same way, precipitation didn't work the same way. Like when you have a supercontinent, it's just nothing in the interior is ever going to be preserved, and you're going to have to get really lucky to get anything on the fringes to be.
That's actually an important thing to bring up. Is at the end of the Permian and the beginning of the Triassic, this is the time of Pangea. Yeah. This is the time that it's
probably one of the reasons the extinction was so bad. There's nowhere to run.
The nearshore ecosystems have been like crushed in between continents. There's like all the beautiful Caribbean seas that would have existed between things they're gone, and you get big central deserts. And
climate does weird stuff when you have what's called extreme continentality, which is the term I've
never heard that. Yeah, that's a good noun.
Isn't that nice?
I like it. Yeah, that is good.
Just weird things happen with climate. If you're not raining on rocks in the interior of the continent, then you can't scrub any CO2 out of the atmosphere, so CO2 gets really high. But of course, there's much to debate on whether or not more CO2 in the atmosphere is a bad thing. Yeah.
But because
I was being facetious about the CO2 comment.
I trust you on that.
Okay, good. Thank you.
What's interesting about like the weirdness of deposition at this time is, as a consequence, you get a pretty crappy record of land ecosystems. Yep. And because you have this pretty crappy record, we have these weird sort of snippets of knowledge of what's going on between, say, 275 million years ago in the middle of the Permian, when things are going okay, and the earliest part of the Triassic, 240 million years ago, where things are just show the signs of basically recovering from catastrophe.
Yeah.
But how severe that catastrophe was, how quickly it took for a lot of synapsid lineages to die out or diapsid lineages to rise to prominence, we don't know. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the things that I find fascinating about this time is it's just like the world is remade, but we don't know how it happened.
Right.
We don't know the dynamics of that remaking, other than that at the end of this process, you get a reptile-dominated world that, kind of goes throughout the Mesozoic and in some ways continues to today.
So where do you go to find those fossils? Where are the field sites that you frequent?
I'm very much a person who looks at the Triassic period. So I look at the sort of aftermath of the event.
And is that when true reptiles show up, or do true reptiles show up before the extinction?
They show up before. Like those last two animals I brought up, Proterosaurus and Archosaurus from the Permian, are members of the crown group. They're actually closer to Archosaurs than the other major lineages. But they're really the only ones.
Okay.
Although the fossil... So it suggests that all of the initial divergence between those major groups that we have today, it happened in the Permian.
Okay,
But those animals were... they're either not preserved, or at this point we don't recognize them because we don't have the right search image for that kind of part of the fossil record.
That's the other thing we probably mentioned on the show before, but I always like to point out that, like, the further back in time you go, the harder it is to find stuff. Like, that's just a consequence of the way preservation works in deep time. So there's always going to be more ground sloth fossils from the late Pleistocene, to use an example relevant to myself, than there are these early stem and crown diapsids and reptiles that you're looking for in the Permian and Triassic.
And I'm not bitter about that.
I mean,
at all.
You could choose to study sloths. You could change.
I'm not bitter about the multiple columns of Pleistocene geographic downstairs.
They're one of the most reptilian mammals, so,
Yeah, basically. So that's true. Yeah. That's true.
Give them some credit.
I give them... Never mind.
I know what you're thinking. What were Adam and I drinking while we had this conversation? And the answer, sadly, is nothing. We might have had some water, but we were hanging out in the chair's office in the Department of Paleobiology, so not exactly the most appropriate place to crack open a beer. And instead, we just hung out later and had a really funny reptile-themed beer then, but it's something I might have on the show at some point in the future, so I won't spoil what that was. Instead, as I record this, I am drinking an Americano made from my espresso machine using some beans from Stumptown. Stumptown was a roaster that was kind of coming up in the world when I was in college out on the West Coast, and it was based out of Portland. And some of the folks who worked at Stumptown actually left to start Verve, which is a Santa Cruz-based coffee roaster place that I also love. And Stumptown was acquired by Pete's. And normally I'm not a giant fan of, small little companies that I really like getting acquired by larger companies that I'm less interested in. I've never been a huge fan of Pete's Coffee, but it does mean that I can get Stumptown much easier here in DC, so I'm kind of cool with it on that level. This one I'm drinking is a single origin called Mordecofe, or I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right. It's from Ethiopia. I'm a big fan of the single origins. The blends, I've heard when it comes to wine that you often blend things just to get the exact right flavor that you want instead of just relying on the taste from one grape. But when it comes to coffee, I've just never enjoyed a blend as much as I enjoy a single origin. I don't know why that is. I also tend to go much more on the side of the lighter to medium roast. Even some medium roasts from some places are too dark for me. A couple of reasons. Lighter roasts, more caffeine. The longer you roast the bean, the more you leach out or destroy the caffeine. I'm not sure the exact chemistry there, but it makes some sense to me that heat destroys chemical bonds. And I just think you get the flavor of the bean more. So if you're going to get a single origin, if you're going to take something that comes from one specific place in the world and hand it over to me in bean form, I want to know what that bean tastes like. I don't need to know what your roasting machine tastes like. So yeah, that's what I'm enjoying today. That's what I got in the hopper up on the espresso machine. My in-laws just came to town, so they brought me some Verve, which I can't as easily get here in DC yet. So I'm really excited for when this runs out, even though I am enjoying it, to pop some Verve beans in the hopper above the grinder on the espresso machine. So maybe in a future episode, if I'm stuck doing it alone again, you'll hear about that coffee that I'm having then. So now that I'm fully caffeinated, let's kick it back over to the rest of my conversation with Adam. So we have the Triassic world. We have all these groups that have already showed up. So what happens next? Because this is kind of the story of your research, right?
In essence, yeah. It's picking up the pieces to try and understand the full variety of what these animals are doing in the Triassic period, and then using that variety to sort of inform the gaps that we have from the earliest days in the Permian and Triassic transition. So one of the sites that has formed a central part of my research, because it preserves a good record, especially of smaller bodied animals, things less than a meter or so in length.
Which is another bias in the fossil record. Bigger things tend to preserve better and are easier to find.
And tumble them around in a river and not completely destroy a sloth skeleton.
Or a Pachycephalosaur skull.
Yeah. Although the rest of it.
I know, right?
So there's a site called the Hayden Quarry, which is in Ghost Ranch, New Mexico. It preserves an ecosystem 212 million years old.
Now, is this the one that has like thousands of coelophysis?
It's across the highway from that site.
Highway.
Yeah.
Okay. Is that site from the same time period? Or
no.
Wow.
So they're both late Triassic. Okay. There's tons of Triassic fossils just littering the Chinle Formation.
Chinle?
In New Mexico, Arizona, Utah, and Colorado, I think it extends into. So it's a massive exposure on the Colorado Plateau that preserves, a huge stretch of the Triassic in Western North America. And it's historically been really important because that's where you get early dinosaurs. You get these giant crocodile-like reptiles called phytosaurs, giant herbivorous armored critters called aedosaurs. This is where our conception of the Triassic as the first stage in this reptile-dominated world really came about. But I mentioned giant multiple times because a lot of our record of those things is just the big stuff. It's the things with big, well-consolidated skulls and limb bones. and not so much of the smaller animals that actually make up a majority of
Biomass.
of the ecosystem. Yeah. And so I was, by my graduate advisor, Alan Turner, I was invited to come out to this Hayden Quarry site in New Mexico very early in my time.
And is it a fossil quarry, or is it like a quarry that they were economic?
No, fossil quarry.
Fossil quarry.
Yeah, so it's a series of just little...
Like I've been to some fossil sites in Florida that are like actual working quarries, but they let paleontologists come and prospect.
Yeah, no, it's not that. It's just a series of
I believe
little...
you're about to inherit a similar site in Virginia.
I am indeed. It's a series of like little mudstone terraces that preserve really good fossils of of basically all kinds of Triassic critters, including smaller stuff. My colleagues and advisors who sort of first developed the site early in the 2000s were interested in it primarily because it produced really good fossils of early dinosaurs and their small cousins in Western North America. It's really the best place to find high quality fossils of those animals in the Triassic on our continent. And that's cool. Mm-hmm. But that left a huge variety of other animals completely unidentified, although we had tons of material.
So your job is to go find the fossils and then do the identification, write the description, name the species. Have you gotten a name of species?
I have, yeah. Actually, not from this site, though, because one of the quirks of it is it preserves really great small stuff. Like you have limb bones with exceptional qualities of surfaces. You can see all the little scars for muscle attachments down to, just about a centimeter or so in length.
Right, because the thing about preserving fossils like that, and preserving fossils in general, the biggest conundrum with that is you want the dead animal or dead plant or whatever covered up very quickly, but very gently. And mudstone is good for that because it's very soft, fine-grained sediment, and so, yeah. But that's kind of it's like if it gets covered up too quickly and it gets messed up in the process, then you don't get the fossil. But if it doesn't get covered up at all, you never get the fossil either. So it's that weird, you gotta kind of dance on the knife's edge.
So yeah, my initial task was just kind of like, okay, what are these non-dinosaur small reptiles from the Hayden Quarry site? And in sort of developing the identifications for these things, I started to realize, these are clearly from the lineages that date back to that initial pulse of reptile evolution in the Permian. So basically, these are old lineages, even in the Triassic, that date back to those early periods of obscurity.
So you're able
before
to
they rose
connect
to prominence.
them across this giant extinction horizon.
Yeah.
And that's really cool.
And so, in developing the identifications, I basically had to develop the evolutionary tree at that ancient point in their history, because the tree, using anatomical features from other fossils, allowed me to build a hypothesis for what the tree of relationships looks like down there. And then I was able to link the anatomy of these isolated specimens from the Hayden Quarry site to that tree and inform how those animals fit into history, as it were. And it turned out in the Hayden Quarry site, we had two major groups of these ancient reptilian lineages in the environment. One of them is a group called the Tanystrophiids, which bodily, downwards from the neck, look a lot like monitor lizards. Sprawling limbs, kind of long, slender bodies. But their main area of kind of evolutionary experimentation is the neck. Tanystrophiids can have, kind of long necks that look similar to the proportions of like long-necked sauropod dinosaurs, whereas some of them go completely insane and have necks that are actually twice the length of the rest of the body.
And it's funny, I've seen images of these before, and they're wild looking. And something that I don't know if this comes up to you a lot, but when I'm talking to non-paleontologists, and you show them a picture of some really weird animal, the whorl-toothed shark, or these lizards with these necks that are twice the length of their body. And a lot of times people will marvel and just go, well, I don't even know how that thing survived. And I'm like, it didn't. It's dead. Like, they're all extinct. Like, it was clearly, it was a winning strategy for some portion of evolutionary history, but now they are gone. And that usually gets a laugh from people because I think people don't, even when they see the fossil, they can only think about the animal in the context of like it being a living animal. And they sometimes, which is good, I think, that we sometimes forget that like we're living in this world that we inherited from all these crazy forms that came before. So I always enjoy screwing with people and being like, yeah, it wasn't ultimately a good strategy.
No, but I don't know. I think that that besmirches the name of Tanystrophiids. Which
I didn't intend to besmirch them.
I'm sure you didn't. No, because like it's what I think is fascinating about that, and I get that reaction. Like, I don't know how this survived from people. And my response is always, yeah, I don't know either.
Yeah, that's good too.
I try and use that as a jumping off point to say, and that's why it's really important to really to continue to try and understand these fossils in terms of the living animals that they came from, because these were solutions
to something.
I can't fathom why you would have a neck that's twice the length of the rest of your body. And this is not from a small animal. The animal that's proportioned that way, Tanystrophius, the named animal of that lineage, lived on the seashores in what is now southern Europe and actually southern Asia for millions of years in the Triassic.
Well, if I've learned one thing about biology, it's that if you see a really weird trait, odds are it's for sex or for food.
Yeah.
Like, I'm looking at that Smilodon skull across the room, and I'm like, yep, food, probably, maybe some sex in there too, but like, most of the weird things that are extreme and hard to explain come down to a combination of those two things.
Usually, it's when it's food, at least, it's some kind of thing that is so intricate and well crafted by natural selection for whatever it's doing, that it's just so hard to predict what it was without necessarily watching.
Well, do we think these Tanystrophiids were like snapping at fish with their crazy long necks? Or
well, what's remarkable about them is that's long been the idea, that if you have a crazy long neck, for these animals, they were living on the seashore, they have crazy long necks, therefore they're probably using them as fishing rods, basically.
And in evolution, Julie was having to work on this for one of the exhibits she was working on, and it's really hard to like succinctly explain convergent evolution without confusing people.
Yeah,
but
no kidding.
I'll quote esteemed filmmaker George Lucas. It's poetry. It rhymes. Like, nature doesn't always copy. He was talking about episode 1, which
I know.
Yeah,
I've heard the line.
And so it's like evolution does that too. A lot of times it'll come up with a similar solution to a similar problem over and over again in. That was why I made the joke about ichthyosaurs being marine mammals, because they look so much like a reptilian dolphin. And it's because if you want to be a fast, active swimming animal in the pelagic ocean, you better
end up looking like a tuna.
Yeah, tuna, mako shark, dolphin, an ichthyosaur. Like, it's, these are animals that did not start their evolutionary journey looking as similar as they do, but they ended it there because they needed a solution to the same set of problems. So it's just like Georgie Lucas was telling us in 1997 when he was saying that Jar Jar was the linchpin of everything.
If Jar Jar doesn't work, I don't know how this is gonna happen.
So fishing rod necks, we think.
Maybe it's one of the things that's tough about something like a Tanystrophiid is, as far as I've been able to see in my admittedly limited knowledge of the vertebrate fossil record, is nothing else has done that.
To go on just the super crazy long neck?
In terms of not only the crazy length of the neck, but also the fact that it's not something they do by adding more bones to the neck. They're not more like individual vertebrae that make up a Tanystrophiid neck. They just stretch what they already had to incredible lengths. Like the proportions of a single neck vertebra from a Tanystrophius, it's like a pencil in terms of the relative
changing the number of
dimensions
vertebrae is pretty extreme. There's not a lot of lineages that mess around with that.
Reptiles seem to be okay.
Okay, I guess I'm just being a mammal biased person, because like giraffes and humans have the same number of neck bones. The only mammals that don't have the same number of neck bones as everybody else are sloths and manatees. Those are the only two groups that have experimented with the neck bone thing. There's some really weird connection that seems super tenuous.
Cancer, right?
Yep. There's something about like changing your neck vertebra that changes the likelihood of you getting cancer. And so like sloths and manatees have this weird, and they went in different directions. Sloths have more, manatees have fewer, because that's how sloths are able to turn their heads around and stuff. So
interesting. Reptiles can vary it even within individual lineages, you'll see like variations between like 5 and 10 vertebrae in within a segment, like within the neck. Tanystrophiids, for example, go from the shortest necks have about 9 or 10 cervicals, and then the longest have...
This is just the term for the vertebrae in the neck.
Yes, yes. The longest have 28 cervicals.
Huh.
Tanystrophius has 13.
But they're really long individually as well.
Crazy, ridiculously long vertebrae. So there's not much flexibility. Like, at least not implied by that.
Yeah.
So, and what's insane is the association of that crazy anatomy, that seemingly very specialized set of anatomical features that give you this long and flexible neck, you know. It's not something that's environmentally consistent, because we see those proportions in specimens from the middle of the continent in North America. So we're now, like, we've kind of divorced that crazy suite of anatomical features, that crazy proportions, those crazy necks from the water. And seemingly the explanation that made sense of just having these things not even carry their necks around on land. They're just swimming around using them as fishing rods underwater. That may be true if the one's near shore, but it probably wasn't true of the ones living in Arizona and New Mexico.
That's weird.
It's like, and again, that's why I keep coming back to the fossil record of these animals. It's not only presenting us with information in terms of just the raw anatomy of these things, like showing us these solutions to problems through anatomy and functional morphology that we don't understand. It also like when we find a solution, it can also completely be upended when we discover that animal in an environment where that solution didn't apply.
And so that's happening in the Triassic, and then there's another extinction at the end of the Triassic.
Yep.
And what gets caught in that filter that's relevant to what you're studying?
Basically every one of these kind of ancient lineages that wasn't being studied from, it's like the Hayden Quarry site or a lot of these areas in New Mexico. The reason they weren't being studied all that extensively is they are not survivors of the Triassic-Jurassic extinction. So the reptile dominion is something that really catches on in the Triassic. Once you get to the Jurassic, you see a culling of those reptile lineages down to, I guess you would say, more familiar ones. You get the real rise of dinosaurs as a dominant group.
It seems like the end Triassic extinction kind of opened up a lot of ecological space for the dinosaurs.
But you also see, and at smaller scales, you also see lizards rise to prominence. You see turtles become very, very common in the record. You basically see very familiar early members of a lot of the lineages that we have today. In the Triassic, they're a little harder to recognize because they haven't, like turtles haven't fully evolved their shells, and lizards just haven't risen to any kind of numerical dominance or anything like that.
We did talk about that Triassic turtle fossil where they finally found the shoulder moving inside the clavicle or inside the
chest cavity.
Yeah. That was really cool. That's a really cool fossil.
It's totally insane.
So we covered that on the show. We couldn't resist. So does your research have an end date? Like, do you have fewer questions after the Triassic and once you get into the Jurassic, or do you still have more going on in the Jurassic up to now, I guess?
I guess, I'll use kind of a cop-out answer to that is my research extends to the very, very much to the modern day.
Yeah.
Because the fossil questions I ask are almost entirely focused on the Permian and the Triassic, simply because that's when the lineages that I really focus on in the fossil record
and it sounds
exist.
Like not a lot of other people have taken the time to really do their homework there. So you're really kind of filling in a gap that needed to be filled.
But in interpreting any of the things that I see in these organisms, I would characterize myself as an anatomist then.
Okay.
Because if I see a crest on a bone or a ridge or a scar from a muscle or something like that, I can't interpret what that is biologically for an animal that lived 250 million years ago, unless I have a really strong context for what the anatomy of a modern cousin of that animal looks like. Because hopefully, in the descendants or close cousins of those ancient lineages that are still with us today, you will have some vestige of what that crest or scar or structure on the bones actually represents in terms of the muscles that attach to it, the nerves, the veins, the arteries that are associated with that structure. So I try very hard in interpreting the fossils that I'm looking at to draw from the anatomy of modern lizards, turtles, crocs, and birds to see if there are enough commonalities retained by those modern animals that can be drawn back deep through time to interpret, the bony structures that I see in these ancient groups.
And so where do you see the future of your research going? Like, what's the next big question on the horizon for you that you're really actively pursuing and excited about?
What I view as sort of a 5-year plan goal right now.
Not a lot of time in geologic terms.
No, not at all. But I got time. Is to build up the tree of relationships of these animals and to include fossil taxa, especially on the lizard and the turtle lines that I haven't been able to really study intensively as much as the things on the croc bird line. Build up that tree, build up that sense of sort of evolutionary change in anatomy to the point where I can use computer algorithms to do an ancestral state reconstruction.
So you can basically computer model the OG
what
reptile.
Is going exactly.
Yeah.
Basically to take things back and say, okay, based on our understanding of anatomy, our understanding of evolutionary relationships, track back all of those to the common ancestor of all living reptiles. What do the data right now suggest that common ancestor looked like? And based on that, what was it doing in its environment?
Right.
Did it just look like a chunky lizard, or was it doing something radically different that we wouldn't have predicted? And then from that ancestor, how did we get the variety
that we see
in
the fossil
Triassic
record and today?
Yeah, exactly.
That's really cool.
Because it all came from somewhere.
2 more reptile questions, and then I want to talk about your podcast. First reptile question, thoughts on reptiles as pets?
I don't really have all that many. I owned a gecko.
Do you think they make good pets? Do you get why people would want them as pets?
Yeah, I do.
For me, I think, obviously I'm a mammal biased person anyway, but like my cutoff for pets, and this is something my wife and I have argued about because she loves a guinea pig, is if I have to keep it in a cage all the time to prevent it from just going back into the wild, even if it would die right away, like if it doesn't have the desire to stick with me, I'm less interested in that as a pet. Whereas like a cat's going to come when they're hungry, a dog wants attention all the time, I'm kind of into that. So reptiles, I've argued with Jason Head about this because he has told me that reptiles do develop whatever the reptilian version of like affection for their person is, and they don't mind being handled. They actually maybe even like being handled just because of the warmth, or maybe they do have like some sort of a connection to the people. So he disagrees with me on this, but I was curious what your thoughts were. Just sort of reptiles.
That's funny.
As pets.
I haven't thought about that in quite a while because I've owned cats for the better part of a decade and a half now, and haven't had a reptile as a pet in 20 years.
All right. Well, if that changes, get back to us.
Yeah, but I understand. I think I can understand a little bit of why someone would want to own a reptile as a pet, because even with my cats, yes, I love the attachment that I have with them, but there's also just an aesthetic like beauty and wonder to even my goofy house cat when he's licking himself on the floor. Like he's just a gorgeous animal.
So if you had to get a reptile as a pet, what would you get? Where's your heart?
Boy. I love Pagona, bearded dragon.
Okay.
It's
That's a lizard? That's a type of lizard?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's an incredibly ornate, spiny, iguanian lizard.
Cool. Good answer. Yeah. Final reptile question. Completely unfair question, but I'm going to hold your feet to the fire.
It's all good.
Best reptile group?
It's Trypanosaurs.
Wow, you answered very quickly.
Yeah, because I have the right answer.
What are those, and why are they the best?
So they're one of the major groups that I study.
Okay.
They have...
Which of the 5 kind of big groups that we've been talking about do they fall into?
None.
Ooh.
They are of I mentioned that a lot of the things I study are ancient lineages, even in the Triassic period, that already have a long, storied history that we don't know much about. Trypanosaurs have probably the longest and storiedest history that we know nothing about. Based on my analyses, Trypanosaurs are a group that shows up very briefly in the late Triassic period between about 220 and 200 million years ago. Superficially, they look kind of like chameleons. They have long, sort of side-to-side flat tails. They've got long grasping fingers and toes. Some forms have sort of a prehensile organ at the end of the tail that honestly just looks like a claw. So the tail basically ends in what we just call it the tail claw.
Like a grappling hook.
Yeah, which is insane. Some of them have extremely long, toothless beaks that stick out in front of their faces. Their eyes are incredibly large. They face forward, suggesting binocular vision. Their skulls, although we don't have many of them, the few that we have that are well preserved have just these wide, inflated spaces where the brain should sit that suggests that these were pretty
intelligent,
relatively
thoughtful.
Like, they were brighter than the average dinosaur in the time that they were living, probably. Some of them have giant claws on their index fingers that are the largest bones of their forelimbs. They're bigger than like the humerus or any of the other bones of the hand.
That is odd.
And they do insane things anatomically, but like with every region of the skeleton.
Yeah, they really couldn't just settle down at all, could they?
No. And every time I learn something new about them, it blows my mind. Awesome. And that's part of the reason I think trypanosaurs are the best reptile.
What about the best of the living groups? Which major group of living reptiles is the best group?
Gosh.
You can go crocodilians, you can go birds, you can go lepidosaurs, you can go tuataras, or you can go turtles.
You know what? I'm going to give it to the tuatara. I'm going to give it to sphenodonts.
That's such a hipster answer.
No, well, there may be only two species or one species, depending on what kind of genetic data you buy. And they may live on like, a single set of offshore islands near New Zealand. But gosh darn it, if they don't look, of all of the living reptile groups, if you saw the skull of a Triassic croc relative, it would not resemble, like superficially, you wouldn't see the resemblance between it and a modern croc. If you saw the skull,
But I heard they were living fossils.
Shh.
I know.
Quiet you.
We've talked about that on the show before. Not a fan of the term.
If you saw the skull of a turtle from 240 million years ago and compared that with the skull of a modern turtle, you'd be completely confused. But if you saw the skull of a sphenodontian, a cousin of the tuatara, from the middle part of the Triassic and held that up next to the skull of a modern sphenodon, you'd really see the resemblance right away.
And are these the ones that have like the weird light sensing organ?
Some lizards do it too, but all the one or two species of modern sphenodon all have like the pineal eye, the light sensitive organ, just situated right in the middle of the top of the head.
Weird. Well, as long as we can agree that legless lizards who aren't snakes need to get it together, because that's just annoying and confusing. I think we're good.
It bothers. It does bother me.
It's a problem.
As well.
Like, don't be if you're a lizard, have legs or be a snake.
It's almost as if there's this phenomenon in evolution where multiple groups try and achieve the same anatomical solutions to resolve a problem.
I refuse to accept that as an explanation.
It's true.
You are also a podcaster.
I guess so.
Tell us about your podcast.
I am part of a 3-person team that produces Pastime, which is a podcast focused on natural history in general. We try and target kind of a broad audience. If you're someone who
listens to science, sort of.
Actually, I'm not sure. Yes. Well, yes.
No,
definitely.
You don't want our audience?
I would love your audience. No. I just don't want to bore your audience, because Pastime is not a boring show. I'll say that. But it's very much targeted at sort of the Discovery Channel type audience that knows science in terms of like the middle school level of understanding, but hasn't necessarily pursued it beyond that.
Okay.
So we very much want to target those sort of folks with the latest in discoveries from natural history, from paleontology, to inform just the history of the planet.
Is there a favorite episode, or an episode you want to point people to if they haven't listened before? Like, here's your first.
Honestly, as crappy as the audio is, and I like the idea of doing the special edition version with more Gungans. in the Mos Eisley scene. I like the idea of doing a special edition of actually our first episode of Pastime, which is it focuses around an interview with paleontologist David Krause about fieldwork in the Cretaceous period of Madagascar, and not only the incredible fauna of animals, including dinosaurs, mammals, crocs, all kinds of things that they discovered there, but also the general question of how do paleontologists decide where to dig in the first place. I think that's a good episode to start with, to not only be introduced to myself and my first co-host, Matthew Bortz, now curator of fossil primates at the Duke Lemur Center. He and I started there, and I think that is a good episode to start with.
I mean, that's easy. If you can recommend the first episode, that's
first
really
one
good.
Isn't bad.
So I imagine your show is available wherever the person is getting this episode from.
Absolutely.
Who's listening.
Yeah.
You can go get Pastime as well. Pastime.org is the website if they want to go check out the website, but we'll link to that in the show notes to this episode. And Adam, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me. I hope your audience enjoys.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Okay.
This was a good interview.
They're easily entertained. That's
Yes.
good. That's good. I like to go with that.
So hopefully you all enjoyed that conversation with Adam. I had a blast talking to him. I would love to have him back on the show again. Do go check out his show, Pastime. Like he said, you can just start at episode 1 and start working your way through. They do a great job of explaining paleontological concepts, and I have an interview that Adam and I recorded during that same session, so at some point there will be a sloth episode. You'll just have to wait for it, and when that comes out, I will be sure to promote it here. But in the meantime, let's do some PaleoPOWs, which is a segment of the show where we deal with feedback from the listener. And since I mentioned sloths, let's keep it going on the sloth train with a message from Daniel W., who says, "Love the show and sloth shoes. Hey guys, love the show and I've been listening since way back. You've been my companion on several long road trips across Colorado and the rest of the US. I definitely appreciate everything you guys have done over the years. I also got a random ad from Tom's Shoes about some sloth print shoes. Had to share with you guys. Thanks again for everything. I'm usually drinking a Dale's Pale Ale if I'm listening to you at home. Cheers, Dan." That's a very Colorado-centric message, especially since there is a fossil sloth from Colorado. It's a Megalonyx. The Megalonyx was kind of everywhere in the Pleistocene. Couldn't stop it. So, I took a look at these shoes. They're very cute shoes. Unfortunately, I guess true to the name of the show, I am not in the market for any Tom shoes because Adam, not the Adam I just talked to, but Adam Conover of the television show Adam Ruins Everything, did a segment on Toms that kind of ruined the idea of Toms for me. So I won't be buying these shoes. I can link everybody to the YouTube clip where Adam explains the logic of why the buy one and one goes to charity model for a for-profit company is a little bit suspect and maybe not as charitable as one might hope. But what it really comes down to is the shoes are sold for much more than even 2 pairs of the shoes. So the company still makes a lot of money, even if they're giving 1 pair of shoes away for free. And in doing so, you have the opportunity to economically impact in a negative way the places where you're giving away free shoes, all the people who make, buy, and sell shoes as their profession. So, yeah, I don't know. I hate to be one of those people that like has a moral philosophical reason to be against things. It's not a fun position to be in, but in the world we live in with the unintended consequences of every action, as we've learned from watching The Good Place. Hey, if you're not watching The Good Place, watch The Good Place. Great show. It can be hard to do the right thing, but in this instance, I will have to abstain from the sloth shoes. But, you know, sloths have become super popular in pop culture, so I can always find sloth stuff. And I now see that these are women's shoes, so they probably wouldn't fit my feet anyway. But we always appreciate getting an email in. Happy to hear things are going well driving around Colorado. Hopefully you are not doing your road trips with the Dale's Pale Ale, but that's also a fine beer. And yeah, very Colorado-centric email from Dan. Thanks for writing in, Dan. I also want to take a moment to thank Doug S., who at one point was a recurring donor to the show, and I've been going through and doing an audit of all the recurring donations from the entire history of the show, basically, whether they're current or canceled. I don't say canceled to put any value judgment on it. It's just the message PayPal sends when the donation window ends. We appreciate any amount of money given over any period of time. So it's all coming from a place of appreciation. But what happened with Doug S. is Doug S. gave one-time donations twice and was thanked twice, and then later started a recurring donation for which we failed to thank Doug. So we need to go back and right that wrong, because if you give 3 times, you're going to get thanked 3 times. It's just the science sort of motto. That's not our motto, but it's what we're about. It's what we believe in. We believe in thanking people when they deserve to be thanked. So Doug, thank you so much for giving to the show twice and then deciding that the return on investment was good enough to go ahead and set up a recurring donation. Apologies for not thanking you sooner. Totally our bad. I'm going through, I'm auditing the books. It's not as simple as it sounds. It's a lot of searching an email back catalog for vague terms to make things pop up and then count and cross-reference that against show notes. And it's just, it's worth doing. I'm taking the time. I'm getting it done. But it does mean that as people may have slipped through the cracks, they hopefully will slip through the cracks no longer. And we're going to get it fixed for you, Doug, and everyone else who's still waiting. So if you're still waiting, I'm sorry. We're working on it. We're getting there. I promise. Finally, I want to read an email from frequent listener, interactor, contributor, Caryne H. She listened to episode 309, my interview with Matthew LaPlante, which was a great interview because he is just a really fun guy to talk to, too. So I guess if there's a theme for the messages, it's just cool conversations with cool people that I'm excited to have cool conversations with again in the future. Maybe we could get Matthew and Adam on the same episode. That could be fun. I bet they'd have a lot to talk about. We should do that. Why haven't we ever done a crossover where 2 past guests come back on? I mean, I guess it's kind of what Matthew does with his Undisciplined show. I'm having all kinds of ideas right now. It's a good thing I'm talking into a recording device, so I'll remember these later. Okay. Caryne says, here I am. And Caryne, I think I've heard you say your name in a voicemail that this is how it's pronounced. It's not necessarily how I'd pronounce it based on the spelling, so I apologize if I've gotten that wrong before. I apologize if I'm getting it wrong now, but I think I remember that's how you said it in the voicemail. So, Caryne says, here I am, data entering at work, listening to episode 309, and it brought a smile to my heart. Ben will be so pleased to hear that. The conversation with Matthew LaPlante really hit home since I've just finished my application to graduate school. For my application, I had to write a statement of purpose, and I adopted the martini glass style of writing. And after listening to Matthew speak, I realized I maybe should have put my point up front, the reason for my email subject line, which again was, why didn't I listen to this episode when it came out? There was also a part where Ryan and Matthew were talking about how they loved learning, but they rushed to get out of school to no avail. I know I'll forever be a student, just collecting more and more knowledge. Thanks for the podcast. Makes typing away at my computer much more enjoyable. Well, I'm glad to hear that. And I know I also struggle with putting my point first when I'm writing or talking out loud right now, as you can probably hear in your ears. But it's always good to know that our podcast maybe has some practical advice for people who want to change things up or try doing things a different way. So I don't think the martini glass is necessarily a bad thing. I think Matthew was a little more down on it than I was, if I remember correctly. But always good to make your point as early in your writing as you can, I think. And it is something I struggle with too. So let's all work on it together. Okay. Hope grad school is going well for all the people, especially going back to school right now. Hang in there. We got this. We're going to get you through the year together. Community of the Paleo Posse are in this. If you want to be more integrated in that community, you can go join up on our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/science-sort-of. You can check us out on Twitter, twitter.com/science-sort-of. The show notes for this episode are at science-sort-of.com. And Patreon, PayPal, all the ways you can support us. iTunes reviews, super, super helpful. I imagine there's going to be a pretty seismic shift in the podcast landscape when the Apple switches over to the new podcast platform. I don't think it's going to be a huge shift in the way things come out, but the categories are changing. So I think a few new reviews will really bump us up in the ranks. So if folks can do that, that would be awesome. And thanks for listening. Hope you had a good time with the interview. We already got next episode recorded. I'm editing it now. It's another really great interview. You're really going to enjoy it. I'll give you a hint. What's coming down the pike? Everything's going to die. And that's all I'm going to tell you. You can maybe figure it out from there. Have a great rest of the time in between this episode and the next one, where in the next episode, we can promise that you're going to get a whole lot more science. Sort of.
Visit sciencesortof.com for show notes, links to all the stories we talked about, and ways to interact with the hosts, guests, and other listeners. Science Sort of is brought to you by the Brachiolobe Media Network of podcasts, with audio engineering by Tim Dobbs of the Encyclopedia Brunch podcast. That's all for this week. See you next time on Science Sort of.
to say sort of, folks. I did it. Finally remembered. It's going to start being a thing. Hang on to it. Let's go. Bye.